Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are you hearing it? Welcome to the fall meeting of the Ripon Historical Society. We have a series of 3 before Christmas. September, and we're going to look at the legal aspects of the origins of Ripon. And then we'll follow again with George Miller in October. And he'll continue that same subject and elaborate a little more about it. And then in November, Laura Grant will be speaking about, now, be sure you get this right, fashions in tombstones. And anybody who's been to a cemetery realizes that there is a fashion to the tombstones. You can kind of date them by some of the elaborate designs and the figures and that type of thing. So she's going to talk about how you can date the cemeteries around here on the basis of the fashions in the tombstones. In November, we're going to be having our annual election, and I want to mention the people, the overwhelming number of candidates we have for office. For example, Bill Woolley, whom I'm sure you all know, has agreed to be president. And Todd Behrens, who's now acting as president, will continue as vice president at last. Our treasurer will be Roberta Walker from M&I Bank, who I'm sure you all know. And our secretary will be Shirley Williams. Now, in case you think that you were crowded out of the running, we have ample opportunity for anybody out there who would like to run for office. And I assure you that the candidates at the present time have a lot of experience, but we're looking forward to having you have the experience. So if you have an inclination toward wanting to be president or vice president or secretary of the Historical Society, be sure to see me. Okay, with that now, we'll go to our program for tonight, which will be done by Steve Sorenson. Now, Steve, I want to mention that when I was president of the Orange County Historical Society, almost every speaker that I introduced to the audience, no one knew them. The nice thing about Ripon, Wisconsin, is when we introduce somebody, oh, I know him. Tonight, Steve Sorenson, our lawyer of many years here in our community, will be speaking to you about the early history of our court system here in Ripon. Steve.
Thanks, Todd. I'm going to probably, can everybody hear me if I talk without the mic? Yes. As an attorney, we're taught to project, and it's generally not a problem for me to project pretty well. And not only am I an attorney, but I also teach at Ripon College, so teaching students at 8 o'clock in the morning when they're trying to sleep, I have a tendency to raise my voice a lot also. My program this evening, when Todd asked me a long time ago, and then some other people followed up and said, will you do it? I didn't know how much work it was going to be. I thought it would just be something I could pretty much do off the top of my head and take a look at a few articles. And as I got more and more into this, I got more and more excited about finding things out. And the result is, quite frankly, what I'm going to be presenting to you tonight is just the start of what I think will probably be a 3-year project. I have a young lady who's working in my office, and I think between her and myself, we'll spend at least the next 2 years putting together what I will ultimately call the legal history of Ripon and probably also Green Lake County, because I am the historian for the Green Lake County Bar Association, and I've been trying to gather records for about 5 years from that organization. Let me start by taking you back further than you want to go. But I think to understand the history of the legal community in Ripon and its emergence as I think I use the topic, emergence as a powerhouse, you really do have to go back to the early days of the Wisconsin Territory. Now, I could take you back to the days of the Michigan Territory when Wisconsin was part of it, because that's really when the first lawyers appeared on the scene in the state of Wisconsin. But their prominence was not as lawyers as much as it was as, I suppose you would say, adventurers or manipulators of the soil to some degree, but more of speculators and adventurers. It really starts, Wisconsin's history really starts in Green Bay for the legal community. Because the first territorial judge of any prominence came out of Green Bay. And I don't know if you know this or not, but the state of Wisconsin was originally divided as a territory into 4 judicial districts. There was the Brown District, which was really Brown County, and Brown County stretched all the way from the northern reaches of the state of Wisconsin down to basically just north of Milwaukee, and that was the 2nd district, which was called the Milwaukee District. And then both districts split kind of what I would guess is Dodge County, for example, was in the Brown District, but Jefferson was in the Milwaukee District. And they went all the way to Dane County, and then at Dane County, everything that was west of Dane County, but south of the Wisconsin River, ended up what was called Iowa County. And then where the Wisconsin River came down into Prairie du Chien, anything north of that district was called Crawford District. In the early parts of Wisconsin, I'm talking about probably the 1830s, 1840s. Around 1844 is when you really started to see an organization taking place in the Wisconsin. The biggest district was Iowa. The largest population was in that part of the state. Of course, that was because of the lead mines, etc. And the most controversy and the most need for lawyers was in Brown. And that really had to deal with fur trading and international, if you want to call them, relationships and business relationships, because that's really what was going on in Brown at the time. Now, we started our first territorial court on December 8th of 1836. And the first territorial court, this would be one of those questions, I have a picture in my office if anyone's ever been there. The first territorial court was in Belmont, Wisconsin. And the first Chief Justice of the first territorial court was an individual by the name of Charles Dunn. And I could do a whole program on Charles Dunn. Charlie Dunn was a very, very interesting character. Charles Dunn loved being Chief Justice. He really liked that job. But interesting enough, there was a man by the name of John Catlin, who was the secretary or the clerk of the Supreme Court. And I don't know if anybody recognizes that name, but John Catlin is from here. And another one of the individuals, there were only 16 lawyers that were admitted to the state court, or the territorial court of the Wisconsin Territory on that December 8th, 1836 date. One of the other attorneys that was admitted that day was a man by the name of John S. Horner, which is another name that you should recognize from that list. Another individual that was admitted was a justice by the name of, or excuse me, at that time an attorney, but later a justice by the name of Andrew Miller. Andrew Miller ultimately became the first judge of Fond du Lac County. When they broke up Brown County, and one of the counties that was created out of Brown County was Fond du Lac County, Andrew Miller was the first judge that would have covered the Ripon area, because Ripon was part of Fond du Lac County when they broke up Brown County into the various districts, and that was about 1844. And at that time, Andrew Miller took over. Andrew Miller became the first United States district judge from Wisconsin. That was his claim to fame, and again, coming from our area. So that gives you a little history. So recognize that Catlin, who was from the Ripon area, I think if I did my research correctly, was probably closer to Matoman than Ripon, but probably ended up practicing in Ripon. And the other individual, of course, you know, was John S. Horner. And John S. Horner became a very, very prominent lawyer, not only in Ripon, but also in state politics. But those were some of the very first attorneys in the state of Wisconsin. So as we always say, Ripon's at the lead for everything, and here we are again. Interestingly enough, the majority of the attorneys that were admitted and were the Chief Justice were either from what we today would look at as Dane County, or what we'd be looking at as Iowa County. Dodgeville was huge at that point. And Dane was getting a start because of its very good agricultural land at about that time. Well, that gives you a brief view of what was going on in the state of Wisconsin. Now, I'm not even going to dare in this group try to tell you what went on in the Ripon. I mean, with the phalanx and with the Soresco and Ripon and so on and so forth. But I can talk to you about, with this emergence of a community, and George, I see, is going to talk about the Ripon Charter, which was given in 1858 to the city of Ripon, and something very interesting occurred at that time. But let me take you from 1844, when Fond du Lac gets its first court, until 1858, when Ripon becomes a city. Obviously, you know there's a few lawyers that hung around here. There was a guy by the name of Beauvais. Some of you probably have heard of that individual.
Picture on the wall.
Well, he was a fairly prominent attorney. He was also a fairly prominent newspaper person. He was also a fairly prominent educator. He was also, I mean, this is a man of many talents. But I put together a list of some names. I want to see if any of you can recognize some of these names, because these are the, always be organized. These are the attorneys that were basically in our area at the time. Some of those names you'll recognize, some of them you probably won't. I've got it here because I just looked at it before I came. But there were a group of attorneys that would sign the roll for Fond du Lac County. Just give me a second because I know it. Here it is. These were the attorneys that signed the roll at Fond du Lac County. You've heard one already, John S. Horner, C.L. Catlin, Jerry Dobbs, J.J. Foote, H.E. Giese, Thomas Harris, L.S. Reed, E.L. Reynolds, W.F. Thompson, and W.W.D. Turner. These were starting in about the 1840s to the 1850s, and even up until 1900. These were probably the big names. Also in about 1900, another very large name in the legal community came into the Ripon area. His name was George E. Sutherland. He came into the area, and I'll talk about where they all come to play as we go forward with this discussion. But what you need to understand is this was the first group of lawyers that came to the community. Now, Ripon, of course, had no court. Fond du Lac had the court during the territorial times. Interestingly enough, before the Fond du Lac court, Green Bay was the court we would have gone to. Interestingly enough, before that, the court that anyone would have gone to was the Superior Court, and the Superior Court was located in Detroit, Michigan. To try a case, for example, in 1836 or 1838, you would have had to travel from Wisconsin to the Superior Court in Detroit. And you would have taken, as someone wrote, it would take you 750 miles by boat, and then you'd take oxen, and the travel to court would be, let's say this, you wouldn't have more than 1 or 2 cases a year. And so very, very few people honestly tried cases. Lawyers, for the most part at this time in history, wrote contracts, worked out negotiations, had other jobs because they would go broke if they were just simply thinking they were going to try cases. Now, with the creation of the court in the 1840s in Fond du Lac, we do see some cases evolving. The problem is, to go from Ripon to Fond du Lac was not very easy. It was much easier to go from Ripon to Marquette. Marquette was at that time one of the leading centers in our area to the west. And then of course from Marquette you could always go to Portage, and from Portage you can go just about anywhere, because that was a transportation nexus during that period of time. So we had this pull that was going on about the time that Ripon became chartered as a city in 1858, when the charter was granted in March of 1858. Now understand at this period of time what's going on. You've got Ceresco that's basically gone away as far as the experiment, but Ceresco is still a community. They still like their identity. You have Ripon, which is up on the hill, which is basically Beauvais and Horner, and I'm missing one other name. But they're up on the hill and they want the power. Well, you know where the lawyers were. The lawyers were up on the hill. And these are the people that, frankly, if you go look at the history of Ripon, and I'm sure George will talk about that, they're the ones that took the message to Madison that eventually resulted in the charter being granted. One of the original platforms that was in our request for a charter for the city of Ripon was that Ripon have its own court. At that time they were called special courts or superior courts. The result of the request in the charter was no. We've only granted that to Milwaukee. We've never granted that anywhere else. I don't know who you people think you are. We're not going to grant that. And again, the individual, and George, you can help me on this, E.L. Revels, I think his name was? Reynolds, who became the first representative from this area to the Wisconsin Assembly, was part of that original group along with John S. Horner that went down there, and they understood politics. So they gave up the request for the court. However, in 1861, a mere 3 years later, Ripon, Wisconsin became the second municipality in the state of Wisconsin to be granted its own special court. And that is what I talk about when I talk about the history of Ripon. You have to understand, Milwaukee had its court. Ripon became only the second place in the state of Wisconsin to be granted this special court. And that was very envious. Cities that were growing at this time quite rapidly, like Eau Claire and Chippewa Falls and Wausau, they were requesting special courts, and they weren't getting them. Ripon, and again, I can't find the background, I keep looking, but Ripon was granted this special court. Now, some of it had to do with the great county seat debate, according to Sam Pedrick, an article that George provided to my assistant. And I've heard this as legend, and now I've seen it in writing. Some of it had to do with the great county seat debate that was occurring over in Green Lake County. There was a very large group of people in Ripon that wanted to join Green Lake County because commerce going to Green Lake or going west was a whole lot easier than commerce going east. You've got to remember the first railroad doesn't come to Ripon until 1871. So for us to go to court in Fond du Lac or us to do commerce in Fond du Lac, it's a lot easier to go over to Green Lake, Princeton. Princeton would catch the waterways. It was a lot easier, and there was also this debate, where was the county seat going to be? It started out in Berlin under the first place that was chosen when they elected for the county seat. Ultimately ended up in Dartford, which of course becomes Green Lake, but also there was a movement to try to move it to Princeton. Eventually it ends up in Green Lake. Well, Ripon was playing a role in this all the way along. Throughout this 1858, 1859, and I presume Horner was one of the biggest players. Because I think you understand Horner is as much a part of the Ripon history as he is the Green Lake history. And I'm presuming that he was part of that, that debate. I'm still looking in the courthouse. One of the problems you have with studying legal research in Fond du Lac County was there was a fire that destroyed just about all of the old records at the Fond du Lac County Courthouse. Many very important historical cases were destroyed. Every once in a while, we as attorneys try to find, especially deeds and documents that prove certain rights, and they're gone. And it's interesting enough because Fond du Lac and Green Lake are in the same circuit, and I'll explain how that happens. A lot of the good Green Lake records are also destroyed that have to do with legal activities. So it's very hard to find out what judges did and what attorneys did, which should be preserved in court records because they were destroyed by the burning of the Fond du Lac courthouse. Anyway, here we are, 1861. I want to take you to that date. Because in 1861, we do establish the Ripon Court. And it is a special court. And it has full concurrent powers with the Fond du Lac County Court. That's what makes us unique. Because we're not what we think of today as a municipal court. Anything that a county court could do could be done by the Ripon Municipal Court. The first judge was an individual by the name of Peter Kissam, K-I-S-A-M. Again, Sam Pedry couldn't find anything, and I couldn't find anything on Kissam. He isn't even registered with the State Bar of Wisconsin. I hope he was a lawyer. It says he was a lawyer. But there's no record there. But you need to understand that the State Bar Association really didn't start keeping records till 1878, when the State Bar became an official organization. So we've got this period of time starting in 1861 where frankly we're a powerhouse legally because we have the ability to try all of our own cases right here. Remember now, we only have at this period of time 5 attorneys in the community that are trying these cases or bringing these cases. One of those attorneys is a judge. One of those attorneys is the city attorney, in other words, the prosecuting attorney for the community. So you're now down to 3. So you have 3 attorneys that aren't connected with the court system somehow. Also remember that Catlin, who was one of those attorneys, is also the clerk of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So he's not around here very often. He's obviously down in Belmont. Because if you read the transcripts of the yearly court, which I did for another project, they didn't meet too often in December and January. They never met in August, but basically they met the rest of the year. They only have 5 or 6 cases a month, but they would meet. And so I'm sure that Catlin was down there a lot in Belmont. And of course, it moved to Madison quite rapidly. It didn't stay in Belmont, I think, for more than 2 or 3 years. So understand, that's the legal community in Ripon. Interestingly enough, the attacks on the Ripon court are extreme. Every so often, legislation is introduced trying to get rid of the Ripon court. Now, we did a study of this, and it's interesting. The first court was created in 1861, and it was a court of full power. In 1865, we had to go through the whole process again because some judge ruled that the legislature didn't have the power to do this. And so what they did in 1865 is they found a new way under new chapter they wrote to give Ripon the same court. They did the same thing again 4 years later in 1869. They did the same thing in 1880. They did the same thing in 1882. They did the same thing in 1901. Then we ran into some problems. We're going along fairly smoothly with our own court. Now remember what's happened in this time period. This is important. The railroad has come to Ripon, and the railroad is coming from Fond du Lac. Suddenly we can get to Fond du Lac. Suddenly Fond du Lac likes our community. Understand, and I'm sure that you all, because you're historians in Ripon, understand that this is an industrial community. There is product here. There is money here. There is a college here. There's lots of things going on in this Ripon community that the county seat, which was chosen by the legislature when they broke up Brown County to be Fond du Lac, they kind of are envious of what we have in this community. So there is an attack that goes on at this period of time. And in 1915, they strip away some of the powers of the Ripon court. They limit the Ripon court to actions of less than $50,000. Prior to this time, we had full and complete authority, the same as a county court. Now they've taken away the power to try any case that has a mountain controversy of over $50,000. I'm not a good enough historian that I can convert what $50,000 in 1915 was to what $50,000 would be today, but I think most cases would still fall within that parameter. I'm speculating that would be kind of like 200,000 or something like that, maybe more today. So you still have a lot of power. The other thing they took away was felony court. In other words, we could no longer in the Ripon court system convict someone and then send them off to a state penitentiary. Up until that time, we had the power to do that. We still had the review process that our court had to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. That kept us still as a special superior court. By this time, the records, and this is the Wisconsin historical records, tell me that there are 4 other in the state of Wisconsin. I know one's Milwaukee. I presume, and I can't say this in fact, but I presume one is Wausau, based on the number of cases I was reading that came out of Wausau. And they don't say Marathon County, they say Wausau. And I presume the other one was probably Racine or Kenosha and maybe Dane. Or it could be some city like Ripon that just had the right people in the right place at the right time. But when you look at the cases that came to Madison and were reviewed by by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the only ones you're finding are Milwaukee, Wausau, and there were 2 Ripon cases that I could find when I went back and checked that history as to what cases the Supreme Court was reviewing. And it's interesting that we did have, right now you'd see a case, Fond du Lac Circuit Court, it would say Ripon Superior Court, and it was a special court that was created. That special court, as I said, the first justice was, I forgot his name again. The first justice for that court was Kissman, if I remember right, yes. And then when Kissman decided, well, you got to remember too, he served for nothing. This was a freebie. There was no pay. So this job kind of rotated. Nobody really just, stood up and said, let me be judge this month. I mean, the only thing that kept this job going is lawyers have tremendous egos and they like to be judges, at least for a period of time. Interestingly enough, Horner refused the job every time it was offered to him. He never wanted to be the judge. And again, that would be an interesting story to figure out why. But between Runnels, Dobbs, Foote, and a guy by the name of J. Mayhem, those were our series of judges or lawyers that kept changing over and serving in the role as judge for Ripon. The next interesting or significant part of our history of the judgeship in Ripon comes in, the year was, if I remember correctly, it's 19... Anyway, the case, and I'll find it in a second, it'll come back to me. But anyway, the next significant fact was a judge by the name of Van Pelt. Judge Van Pelt, who was from Fond du Lac, had a case where a Ripon attorney who had an attitude decided that he didn't want Ripon court's jurisdiction to be maintained. Yeah, here it is. The case was in 1939. That's what I thought it was in the 1930s. In 1939, an attorney from Ripon by the name of Attorney Turno, T-U-R-N-O, and again, I couldn't find any historical reference to this individual. I'm sure after this case he was run out of town. Brought a case in Fond du Lac County Court, or Circuit Court, And I'll explain that in a minute, why you have county court and circuit court. Before the circuit court judge, C.F. Van Pelt. Van Pelt, if you study Van Pelt's career, which is a very short-lived career, but Van Pelt was known for his, he shot from the hip from the bench. He was a character in Fond du Lac. He had more than one relationship. There's some great newspaper articles on Van Pelt and his behavior. But anyway, Van Pelt heard this case from this attorney, Turno, saying, my client was garnished. In other words, they came to take away his property based on a judgment, but the judgment is no good because it was entered by the Ripon judge, at that time a Judge Felons. And Judge Van Pelt ruled that that's true, that the Ripon court was an illegal court, that it didn't have the power to handle this case. Well, that case eventually winds its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is looking for an opportunity, at least some of the legal scholars say, to get rid of the Ripon court. But picture the period of time. It's the 1939, 1940s are coming quite rapidly. This country's got a lot of problems. The last thing that the Wisconsin government wants to deal with is Ripon court. Mm-hmm. So what happens is basically this quiet acquiescence develops, which says Ripon court survives, but don't be taking big important cases. You know, when they're big important cases, send them over to Fond du Lac. And there's a memo that I found that talked about, it's over in Fond du Lac, that talked about we now have to take on more Ripon cases. The reality is a new man comes along about this time that changes the whole perspective in Ripon as far as the legal system is concerned, which is, of course, Pedrick. Pedrick now is becoming the legal icon. He's been here long enough. He's developing this aura about himself because he's not only an attorney, a pretty good thing, but he's a part of the college. He's a trustee. He's not only a part of the college, he's also writing for the newspapers extensively. He's a historian. He's a all about town man, okay? And as far as I can tell, extremely well liked and extremely well respected, because you can see the Fond du Lac community saying this is not the time to take on Ripon. You also see the emergence of another very prominent attorney by the name of Lester Burr. Lester Burr is now starting to develop his practice in the shadow of Pedrick. Now, we have other attorneys in town, but boy, you look in your newspapers and your history, you're going to have a tough time finding out who is an attorney in this community from about 1934 to about 1960. It's really tough because Burr and Pedrick, and then of course their prodigy is Tom Kilgore. If you follow the prodigy down the line, and because Pedrick worked for Burr, Kilgore worked for Burr worked for Pedrick, Kilgore worked for Burr. That was the kind of the line of the big cases. I can remember when I came to town when I first came to town in 1975, and then when I came to practice permanently in 1977, all the files were in Judge Burr's possession, but Judge Burr had been dead, and that's why I asked George to look that thing for 2 years. He was gone, but he had all the files. I never understood that. But the personification, at least in the probate area, was Tom Kilgore, and there was also an attorney at that time that had taken over Judge Burr's office called Tom Schrain. But I want to go back to 1939 because this is the first, shall we say, din in the Ripon emergence as a legal power. We're now surviving because we have two strong figures. But the community is starting to shrink. Interestingly enough, the big businesses in town are leaving town with their legal work. That's the other thing that I found happened in the 1930s and 40s, and much more so in the 50s and 60s. It was Barlow Selig and the Knitting Works, and they're taking their work out of town. How do you find that out? You go look at the cases, and you see who their attorneys of record are. And they're Milwaukee attorneys, they're Green Bay attorneys. They're no longer using the local talent, which had not existed. And this was a town that was very strong. The college is no longer using Pedrick for some reason or another. I don't know. I can't tell you that. But there was a lawsuit against the college in the 1940s that I found, and Pedrick is not the attorney of record. And I thought, since he's a trustee, he probably should have been. And it's a name that's out of the community. At that time, I think the name was from Oshkosh. So anyway, this is what's happening in the Ripon legal community at this time. The court is still moving. It's every Thursday. It's every Thursday afternoon. Since 1861, it's been every Thursday. Ripon Court meets every Thursday. I also think that maybe what was happening at this period of time is Thursday is Men's Day, so maybe there was no one was there to go to court anymore. I can't answer that question or not, but interestingly enough, it stays, and it's still every Thursday they have this court in Ripon. We have our own judge, we have our own clerk of courts, we have our own court records. They had a record, and this comes out of your historical society. It looks like this, and somewhere there has to be a ledger that says these are all the cases and these were all the decisions, because there was a clerk of the Ripon court. Now, in the state of Wisconsin, something's also happening. The state of Wisconsin's court system, we've had too many special courts. We've had too much special legislation. We've created courts. We've created juvenile courts. We've created courts for, they had a very impolite word at that time, but the mentally insane. We have these special courts that are getting created all over the place when there's a special need. We have maritime courts. We have courts that are being created to handle lumbering issues. Well, and then of course you pack those courts with people who sympathize, because the governor is appointing these judges, who sympathize with who the governor is. And those of you that study political history in the state of Wisconsin know that our governors were very powerful people, and they appointed people that they liked. I mean, patronage has never been a naughty word in the state of Wisconsin. And that shows for judges too. Although all judges are elected, don't get me wrong, we've always had elected judges in the state of Wisconsin, but most people start their political or their legal career as a judge by being appointed. Very, very few win election or run for election against an incumbent. It's usually there's an appointment, and that's how you get there. So this is happening. In 1878, the Wisconsin Bar Association is formed. We had no bar association in the state of Wisconsin since the 1840s until 1878. In 1878, the Bar Association is formed. And it's basically formed by big Earth City attorneys, which was really a blow to a lot of the legal community that had been operating in these smaller special courts. It even gets worse in the 1920s, when the Bar Association becomes very, very powerful. And one of the things I'm going to leave with the Historical Society, whoever wants it, back in 2003, one of my projects when I was president of the State Bar of Wisconsin was it started the history of the State Bar. In 2003, I was president of the Bar Foundation, and we did a reenactment of the first meeting of the State Bar Association. We took the transcript that had done by the secretary, and we rewrote, and I made a play, wrote a play out of the reenactment of the first meeting, and I'm going to give that to the Historical Society. There's probably not a lot of people in the world that care, but maybe you can put it somewhere and collect dust with it. But it's very, very interesting to understand what happened. The legislature was trying to take over the Bar Association instead of the courts. They got the most powerful people in the legal community. At that time, there was a Chief Justice Ryan, who was extremely powerful both in the state and nationwide. And that Chief Justice came in, we formed the Bar Association, and we started running lawyers for office. Now, lawyers had always been running for office, but they weren't like sanctioned members of the Bar Association. In other words, the trade association, as some people would say, but we don't ever say that. It's just like teachers are never part of a trade association. The reality gets to be that stems the tide, but it also starts a role in the legislature towards cleaning up the court system. And the first serious cleanup effort is in the 1950s. In 1959, the legislature reorganizes the court, and in the 1959 legislation, what happens is the special courts that had existed in the state of Wisconsin, and there's not that many left, but Ripon was one of them. The special courts in the state of Wisconsin are eliminated, just done away with. The legislation says it reorganizes the courts below the circuit court level into one single court called county court. All municipal, superior, district, civil, children, etc. courts are abolished and replaced by the new county court. The county court shall have exclusive jurisdiction over probate, juvenile, adoption matters, and concurrent jurisdiction with the circuit courts over criminal matters. And so what we've done now is we've taken the system that recognized local concerns and issues, we've abolished it, and we've replaced it with the county court system. And we've now taken the circuit court which used to be a combination of several counties, and we've empowered them to work concurrently. So we took away power from the circuit court because now they got concurrent jurisdiction, but we made these county courts very, very powerful. And guess who pays for the county court? This is why the legislature is so smart. The county pays. Previously, the state was pumping money into all these things. So suddenly we needed money, so we let the counties pay for these county courts. Counties are happy because it empowers them. They don't have the state anymore. They got rid of the marshal system. Now we only have county sheriffs that are enforcing laws. Ripon, by the way, do you know Ripon for a long time had 2 U.S. Marshals? We had 2 assigned U.S. Marshals appointed theoretically by the President of the United States. What they did, I don't know, but they were there.
Was that Civil War?
What?
Was that Civil War?
That was in the 1858, 59, 60, 61. That's because they obviously sat in the Ripon court because they needed something to do, I guess. But we had a chief of police, but we also had these United States Marshals. We just didn't have that much U.S. stuff around us. In other words, federal lands, but we had. Okay. The other thing they did is they made the system so that there was an administrative system for the Supreme Court, and they, in other words, the Supreme Court by this time had grown to the current 7-member court. It started out at 3, ended up at 7. And then, as a platitude, we created the Justice of the Peace. There had always been this Justice of the Peace thing, but now we gave them some power. And we said the Justice of the Peace could have those activities based on a fee basis that the county courts would allow them to do. Effectively, what that meant is if your community was willing to pay a Justice of the Peace to perform services like keeping the peace, then you could have a Justice of the Peace. And he could carry out, or she could carry out, by this time we have female lawyers, could carry out the duties or responsibilities for things like municipal ordinances. But they were not a court of final jurisdiction, meaning if I don't like what the Justice of the Peace decides, I can go to county court. And whatever happened in the city court or municipal court has no meaning at all. If I like what the judge in the community says, I'll accept it. And guess what? The municipal attorney can't appeal. Because it's his court. And it's an interesting dichotomy that starts to evolve, and we have these Justice of Peace. And they're fee-based. And that's what's really interesting. I mean, how did Judge Burr, for example, who was our Justice of the Peace when we eradicated in 1959 our special court. Justice Burr, by the way, was he was the judge of the special court when it was done away with in 1959. How did he make his money? Well, you needed something notarized. You went to the Justice of the Peace. Because to have the Justice of the Peace notarized was really a lot better than having the banker do it. And so what was happening is they were collecting fees. Marrying people, performed all the civil ceremonies, And I'm guessing there was lots of things that they had Judge Burr do, and maybe some people remember. But I know that as I read the Commonwealth, he did lots of things when he was Justice of the Peace. I mean, he was always referred to, at least in the legends that I've heard, as Judge Burr. I mean, I've never heard him referred to as Attorney Burr. It was always Judge Burr. So, but that existed then from 1959 forward. Now, Ripon wasn't happy. Ripon wasn't happy at all. Along came a supplemental piece of legislation that said the county has the right to establish a county court in any community that has appropriate facilities to hold court. Go down to City Hall and you will see, of course we can't see the one that burned down, the current City Hall, and look at the council chambers. If you've ever asked yourself why the council chambers in Ripon are built the way they are, they were built because they were an appropriate facility to hold court. You have the judges, the DS, just to the side you have, where the clerk would sit and where the court reporter would sit, or the witness stand is just off to the side of where the court reporter sits. Ripon council chambers is a courtroom. It has a bar. In other words, there's a place that separates the lawyers theoretically from the audience. That's why you have those swinging doors and you have the bar area, because Ripon City Hall was built for court. Because Fond du Lac County, and some of you remember a person by the name of Al Nowitzki? Al was very powerful in county government, and there was a predecessor to him that I don't know. But Al told me this story. As long as he was county board chair, there was going to be a Ripon court. And then I can't remember, somebody else from this area, Blodgett or somebody else, was chairman of the finance committee. I mean, we controlled Fond du Lac County in some ways during that period of time. But the kicker was we kept the court in Ripon, and the county sent the judge over every Thursday. So Judge McKessie in my day, and Judge Hazen McKessie before my day, this was Judge Eugene, but Judge Hazen McKessie came to Ripon every Thursday. The family court commissioner came in the morning and did all the family court cases that involved Ripon people in the morning. The judge came in the afternoon, and two Thursdays a month he'd do criminal or quasi-criminal stuff. Never really did felony stuff because felony had been gone for a long time, but did the misdemeanors and did the city violations. And then on the other ones, he would do small claims. In other words, the retail theft and somebody suing their neighbor for, less than $5,000, which is what small claims were. So effectively, we in Ripon still had our own court because Fond du Lac County had sent the judge over here. The judges, Hazen McKessie, Eugene McKessie, they loved it. I mean, when I came in 1977, this was going on. It had been going on since the 60s. And the judges loved it because basically for them it was a day out of Fond du Lac. I mean, Judge McKessie used to get done at about 2:30, 3 o'clock with court, and then he held court at the Republican House. And if you read the transcripts, and I don't know if you all know this, but there was the minutes from the Republican House. There was that society that was created at that time. Was Carl Dietrich and Harry Dietrich and Stone. And, I mean, there was a whole group of businessmen in the community that formed that American Foundation for the Preservation of whatever, I can't remember the exact title. But I've got their record book, and I made it a prize. Until every one of them's dead, I'm not turning it over to anyone. I have it under attorney-client privilege. But it's very, very interesting material about how the judge would go upstairs and play cards and gamble and and it's fun to know that was the court system in Ripon, and that's how it worked. And we had these Fond du Lac judges that came over here, and it really was a Homer court. I mean, we did work well. I was city attorney during the last vestiges of it. Well, it was going along well, and Ripon Court was pretty powerful. And we were really doing well, and people were very happy with the system. And then the legislature had to go muck it up again. In 1977, we pass another reorganization bill. That's where the state of Wisconsin took back all the courts. You know, suddenly they said, well, we want control of all these courts. We don't want counties to have control of these courts. So suddenly, we went from what was the circuit court system where you rode the circuit, so to speak. For example, Fond du Lac and Green Lake ended up as one, and I'll tell you why it ended up as one, because Ripon was in the middle. And when this was, there was a Judge Hanson, I think his name was, that liked to come to Ripon to spend the night. And he rode the circuit, so he'd come and he'd spend the night in Ripon, then he'd go to Green Lake, and he'd do his court in Green Lake as a circuit court judge. Only circuit court judges could do felonies, and they had concurrent jurisdiction with major cases. If you had a major case, you went to the smart judge. He was a circuit court judge. That politics has been gone for years, but that's the way it worked. And then he'd come back and he'd spend the night in Ripon, and then he'd go back home. Ripon was seen as a good place to go. And so that's how it was supposed to be. Fond du Lac, Dodge, and Green Lake counties were supposed to be one circuit. They got rid of Dodge. Nobody wanted the prisoners. Absolutely nobody wanted that stuff. That's really crummy stuff. And there's been a prison in Waupun since 1840 something. That was the first state prison was in Waupun, the very first one. I don't know how they found that place, but they did. I think it was because of all the swamps and stuff they put them there. I don't know. I didn't study the history. But what happened in 1977 is we did away with the circuit court judges. Everybody was a circuit court judge. All the judges were employees of the state of Wisconsin. That meant the state could send the judges wherever they wanted. Yes, they were assigned by the county. In other words, they still worked in county courthouses. The state was not about to build new regional courthouses. But we're all in a circuit now. In other words, they can take a Fond du Lac County judge and move him to Oshkosh. They can take an Oshkosh judge and move him to Sheboygan. Take a Sheboygan judge and move him up to Calumet. That happens to be the circuit we're in now. They can move those judges around in that circuit as they're needed. We're in the circuit court system. And with that, interestingly enough, we recreated municipal courts. So in 1977, we could get a municipal court. We couldn't. They took it away from us when it was a special court. But in 1977, we could have gotten a municipal court back, but it was a municipal court in the same sense that a justice of the peace courts were there. You could do traffic and you can do minor things, but if you don't like what your decision is, you can still appeal it to circuit court, and you start all over new. Nothing that happened in the municipal court can ever be used or set against you. Ripon has never elected to have their own municipal court. The town of Ripon has, by the way. The town of Ripon left us in about 1985 or 86 and started doing different things, and now they're over in North Fond du Lac, which I can't figure out for the life of me, and I'm sorry if anybody lives in the town of Ripon. But it makes no sense at all why somebody that gets picked up for speeding in the town of Ripon has to go to North Fond du Lac to a court that means nothing, because they can then appeal it to a court in regular Fond du Lac. It defies logic, I'm here to tell you. But anyway, they did away with the any special courts like we had in Ripon. However, Eugene McKessie was on the bench. Eugene McKessie liked to come to Ripon. Okay? He was now a state employee. So the county government couldn't tell him what to do. They could tell the family court commissioner that he couldn't come here anymore. So at that time, Robert Fowler couldn't come here anymore. Then it became Tony Sanfilippo and so on. But I don't know if any of you remember Anita Andrick, who was, I think, the second county administrator. She made sure nobody came to Ripon. And that's another story you could read about someday. But the reality is, Eugene McKessie kept the Ripon court alive. He would come here once a month on a Thursday afternoon. He moved it to Wednesday because that was a better day to be in town. But he was his own man. He'd just say, I'm going to do Ripon court. He was not the senior judge at the time. J.P. McGalloway was, but McGalloway didn't care. He was the probate judge. That's all he ever wanted to do. He hated the system of circuit court judges, because that's the other thing that happened. You couldn't just be a probate judge anymore. You had to be an all-purpose judge. And so we kept the Ripon court. We kept the Ripon court until Eugene McKessie went off the bench. And then, of course, Judge Grimm became the chief judge. And when Judge Grimm became the chief judge, he said, no more. Okay. But then, guess who's on the county board? An attorney. Who's in charge of what committee? What they call PPP, Protection of Properties and Persons. Therefore, they don't want to anger me. Therefore, I say, yeah, but we could have a court commissioner come over. Otherwise, we'll create a municipal court, and then we'll take your revenue. So, to this day, because of that 6 years I spent on the county board, we still have Ripon Court. We're one of the very few courts in the state of Wisconsin that still has a municipal court that has no right to be there. But once a month, the first Thursday of the month, in the morning now, we hold Ripon Court so that our police officers, for first appearances and so our city attorney doesn't have to run over to Fond du Lac to do traffic court ordinance violations. Now, we don't have anything serious over here. It's just traffic court, it's just juvenile court, it's just the minor infractions. It would be nice to get back Ripon Court, but it's gone. Excuse my language, it ain't never coming back. But it's a court as it exists right now that still has primary jurisdiction. There are two of us that handle court. I handle it, I'm a judicial court commissioner, and the county corporation council is also a judicial court commissioner. And when I sentence somebody, that's it. You don't have a second shot. Which if we had a municipal court, it wouldn't be the end. You could always go do it. So we're still a court of original jurisdiction, meeting in Ripon, using a court commissioner. And one of the reasons we can do it is I don't charge very much, and court commissioners have all the powers of a judge except the power to put somebody in jail. So everything else we can do. And so I think at least during my lifetime here in Ripon, we will maintain what's called the Ripon Municipal Court, which really isn't a municipal court, it's really a court of original jurisdiction. So you can say this is the emergence of Ripon into a powerhouse. I think that was what I used. I don't think that's quite correct, but I'll tell you what, it's interesting history. It's interesting history about how Ripon, Wisconsin has maintained itself. I mean, little things that have happened within the Ripon legal community. We've had no, I suppose, we've had no one go to become, governor or anything like this. I suppose the fact that I became president of the State Bar of Wisconsin and president of the National Association of Bar Presidents is probably the highest ranking lawyer we've ever had at a national or state association. But we're respected and we're looked upon. The thing that I was just telling some of the college students that are here is the number of Ripon College graduates that are judges. I mean, we have two now. One just got off the Supreme Court, and one just joined the Supreme Court. So for the last probably 20 years, we've had a Supreme Court justice from Ripon College. We have, my last count, 6 sitting judges in the state of Wisconsin that are Ripon College grads. And that isn't, I know there's some that are out in other places. I know we have at least one federal judge that's a Ripon College grad. And for a small liberal arts college, that's pretty good. So we are an interesting legal community. And it does go all the way back to Horner and Beauvais. I mean, this community was basically started by people that were progressively thinking lawyers that build a strong foundation. We've had some leadership with Pederick and with Burr during the years, and so it does make for an interesting history. I'm done. Unless you guys have any
Do you have any questions? Anybody have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'll start with, when I started doing some family genealogy once, and I went over to some library in Oshkosh and to get naturalization records and so forth, and he asked me where I was from, and I said I was from Ripon, and he's like, oh, you're gonna have trouble. And when I went back through, I didn't bother with me, one of my great-great-grandfathers petition for naturalization from the Ripon court, and that was in 1894, I believe. If you were like a resident here then, is that where you had to go? You couldn't?
No, you could have went, we had concurrent jurisdiction.
Yeah,
You could
that's
have gone to Fond du Lac, you could have gone to Fond du Lac.
And it would be valid either way?
Yes. We had
Okay.
concurrent jurisdiction.
Would there be a particular reason why you would want to go to one place or the other?
It's a long walk.
Well, but I had another one of my great-great-grandfathers who did the same naturalization petition in, I believe it was like 1915. But he went to Fond du Lac.
Yes, 1950, you remember, was the time period when the Judge Van Pelt, no, excuse me, that's not Van Pelt, that's 1915, it was a period of time for about 6-8 months we didn't exist. And that's when we were reenacted back in 1915, where they took away our power in 1915 by an act of the legislature, and then we were rebuilt later. So there was a period of time right in the 1915 that we didn't have the power to do those kind of things. So he got into that period of time, very short period of time. Ripon Superior Court was a lot of the power of Ripon Superior Court was taken away, but we got it back.
Okay. The other thing I was wondering, and I don't mean to offend anybody, and I don't know how the county boundaries came to be and all that kind of thing, but I've always noticed that the city of Fond du Lac and basically the eastern half of Fond du Lac County is very Roman Catholic. And this part of the county is not nearly so much so. Did that play into some of this?
It does in the legal community. If you notice that most of the judges in Fond du Lac, most of the lawyers in Fond du Lac were Irish Catholics, some German Catholics, and that had a significant, I think, input in the early years of why we didn't want to go to court there. You know, you're a good Episcopalian, you don't want to go to an Irish Catholic court, and I can say that without, but that's a reality. But that was one of the reasons we wanted to go to Green Lake
I was
County.
gonna say, is that part of the reason why?
Well, the
Ripon-
problem was, they went to Berlin with that first courthouse. Do you want to see Irish Catholic or do you want Polish Catholic? And I really do believe, and I can't call the minds of people, but I'm thinking, why not just get my own courthouse? Because if I go to Green Lake, there's no way I'm going to be able to argue with the legislature, I need my own courthouse. Who's controlling that courthouse at that time? The Polish Catholics from Berlin. The fur and leather traders, which are either French or Polish. And again, it's Catholic. This was an enclave of Protestants for the most part. At least the leadership was. The attorneys were, for sure. I can go through those names again. You're not going to find any Polish or Irish. They're all English names. Almost every lawyer came to this area from New York. Some from Connecticut or Vermont. But that's who settled this area, and that's who was prominent. So we're on an island. You have to look at that. That's one thing I think sure historians will tell you about Ripon, Wisconsin. It was an island. There was nobody like us around us. So yeah, that's a struggle, and I'm sure that was part of the reason we would have liked to join Green Lake. But again, you just ran into the same problem there, and I gotta believe there were people thought, I got this group to choose from or that group to choose from. It's kind of like even today. Do I go live in Berlin or do I go live in Fond du Lac because they won't let me live in Ripon anymore? I don't know if you know, I'm the chairman of the board of the Community Health Network, which has a hospital in Berlin, and we're trying to put Ripon Medical Center and Community Health Center together as one unit. Call it what you want. We call it IT most of the time. Get it put together as a medical community. One of the problems is we're still fighting these football games, and we're still fighting Protestant versus Catholic, even though Ripon, is a significant Catholic population. It's an issue that it's hard to overcome some 100 years later. So you can imagine what it was like in the 1850s. I really do believe. I have no substantiation for that, but I really do believe that's true. Because I can go look at the judges. That's what I did. Every once in a while you get, for example, there was a Hanson in there that came out of Fond du Lac. He didn't stay long, he went to the Supreme Court. So he was an outstanding jurist that didn't stay in Fond du Lac very long. But there were Dohertys and Doors and you had McKessie's and McGalloways, and these were names in the judicial circles, the Fond du Lac, in the courtrooms, the Fond du Lac for long, McKibbage, those are all Fond du Lac names from the legal community. So I guess yes. Yes, sir.
John Catlin, back in him.
Mhm.
Did he stay in the Ripon area, or did he finally end up in Madison?
I can only trace him for the time from about 1844, 45 until 1905, and he was still in Ripon in 1905.
Curiosity, do you remember if he was from New Jersey?
I think he was from New York, from what I could find.
Most of those early settlers were.
But I mean, I could look and try to find out. But I think he was from New York.
Because I remember the Catlin's from New Jersey. This was frontier America, and then they went back to New Jersey. And I don't know if he might have remained behind, or...
I'll look at my notes to tell you if I've got something. A lot of the people I couldn't trace. I mean, some of them I could. Catlin I could trace because he was with the Supreme Court. But then he pops up again in Ripon in 1905. So he had to be a kid when he first went on with the Supreme Court.
Would you
territorial
ask
Supreme
George what the name of the Catlin is who lived in the house just 2 blocks from here? Because he can't hear me properly.
Richard
He
Catlin?
was the brother of George, the Indian, famous Indian painter.
Okay.
He was a banker, right, George?
Yes, he was a painter.
Well, this is a lawyer.
And I think they were the same family.
One of these lawyers, I can't remember which one it was, lived in the house right here on the corner of Thorne and Watson. I read that in some of the papers. Because of course, you remember, lawyers' offices were always in their home. It wasn't until probably the 1930s that in a small town you'd ever have a lawyer's office that wasn't in his home or her home. But no, it'd be his home. Yeah, if you ever want to read an interesting story or study, I mean, of course, I could go on all day, but there's the Justice Ryan, which I was talking about. He was the one who helped form the Bar Association. Justice Ryan is the one that wrote the very famous, her name was Ella Goodell case, which she said that she applied for admission to the Wisconsin bars. She wanted to be a lawyer in Wisconsin, and the Supreme Court denied her on a unanimous vote admission to the bar because no woman should be subjected to such evil language, and the atrocities of life that you hear about, in the courtroom. It's just a brilliant decision in racism. I mean, in sexism. It just, but it's kind of interesting. This was the Chief Justice of the state of Wisconsin that was trying to save women from themselves.
What year was this?
Oh, was it, 1984? No, I'm kidding. It was like 1912 or something like that, 1905. Yeah, women had been in the bar for a long time in Wisconsin.
There was a Judge Reed my mother always referred to. Now, was he a judge too?
Yes,
Roy Reed?
yeah. There was a
yeah.
Judge Reed here in town that goes back to probably the 1930s, 40s. Yes, sir.
In the 20s, where did they have the courthouse or the court? Where did they meet?
The records that I was able to obtain, and again, I'd rely on George for this, but it seemed to me it was always where City Hall was. It was always in the city building. They always referred to where the jail was, and I presume the jail was in the city
Well,
building.
it was next door,
Okay.
in the triangle where the forensic lady is.
Yeah,
Jail
so-
was next door. to the
Okay, well,
city
but
hall.
the city hall was there, and then the jail was there, so I would presume it's all in that triangle.
I was doing some research on, somebody wanted to, Scat Schneider.
Mhm.
It was a divorce case, and she wanted a piano, and he said no. Well, they wound up gonna get divorced. Well, there was a train blocking her way, and she was crawling under it, and it took off, and she was too. And we went all over around here trying to see a write-up on it or whatever. And she was 21 and he was 27, but
There's nothing harder than trying to find a lot of legal history because a lot of it was destroyed. Because courthouses for a long time said, we can't keep all this stuff. And they would destroy it. It's not like today where you can microfilm it, it took up room. And lawyers are never known for how little they write.
Around Rice Lake, we went to do some research, and they said there was a new register of deeds. He got a hay wagon. He was gonna start out he threw all the records out, and somebody saw the value in that, and if you do research now, you have to pay this certain family.
I take it that if you move to another state, you may find a totally different sort of system.
Absolutely.
So there could be 50 different systems.
Well, yes and no. You
Well,
could.
basically,
There's basically two systems of law in the United States. There's Louisiana, and then there's the rest of the country. Louisiana is the only state in the United States that has canonized law. They have French law. The rest of the nation has English law.
But what I'm thinking of is the way the different groups, you've had this sort of court here, and then you haven't had it, and so forth. Well, this can differ in every state you go to.
Sure, because Wisconsin's one of the few states that still have elections, for their positions. Most people have adopted the Missouri plan. In 1955, Wisconsin looked at the Missouri plan. They looked at it again in the 1977 reform of the courts. The Missouri plan is where a judge is appointed and what they call sit for retention. Nobody runs against them. You can vote them out if you think they're really bad, but you don't have what we have in Wisconsin. How much money can you spend to buy a seat? Which is really becoming a huge problem in the state of Wisconsin. You can say you like one person or another. I happen to like Mike Gableman as a person, but he should have never beat Louis Butler with that campaign. I don't care if they would have campaigned without the slander and without the crap, That's no way to pick judges, in my book.
No.
I think we need to go to a merit system somehow, which most states have gone to. Wisconsin hasn't, because we're a populous state. We're still thinking what's his name? Robert La Follette is still running the state. Those were great times, unless of course you were a businessman and you had to deal with workers' comp, but we're a populous state. Now, the other thing that's different about Wisconsin over a lot of other states is we really do have a tremendous blend of different backgrounds. We have a real heavy blend of backgrounds. When you take, for example, we don't practice in Milwaukee State. If I go to Milwaukee with a case, I hire a lawyer in Milwaukee. I don't ever go to Milwaukee to try a case or to appear in their courts. I don't know their rules. They have their own rules under them themselves. I made that mistake once. I sat in the courtroom all day long waiting for my case to be called. It was never called. And I couldn't figure out why, Well, I wasn't from Milwaukee. If I'd been from Milwaukee, I'd have my case called. So the next time I went, I hired a Milwaukee attorney to sit with me. I was called right away. It's a different world. And as you can say, the world has gotten small, but it's like Cook County. No Illinois lawyer would go into Cook County unless that's where they're from. It's just a different world. And so you can't compare. You can compare the basic premise that we all have fair justice, but beyond that, it's all different. You're right. And Wisconsin's a marital property state, the only state in the nation to have marital property. Other people don't understand it. Most people in Wisconsin don't understand it. But we have community property states, which are your western states, and then we have common law states, which are both your eastern and northern states. And then we got Wisconsin, that has marital property. So we have different, law is different. Wisconsin, by the way, this is the great thing. Wisconsin's the only state still where you can graduate from either Marquette or UW and you don't have to take a bar exam. They recognize the quality of people that graduate from those schools as being far superior to any place else.
Which one did you graduate from?
Marquette. And ask me why. It's our tradition. It's our state's tradition.
Yeah, that reminded me of another thing. You're right. My father always referred to Judge Byrd. That's always he called him. But as I understand it, he never Judge Burr never went to a law school. He actually did the old system where he practiced with a.
Well, you could practice to get a degree in law up until about the 1950s, so he could have, I don't know. That would surprise me that he never went
That's what I
to
heard.
law school, but he could have. He could have practiced under Pedrick long enough, and then you sit for the bar. You know, it's only in recent times that we haven't had to take the bar exam. You know, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you had to take the bar exam. We just, all of us new guys are smarter.
And if you passed the bar exam, that made you an attorney, huh?
No,
Yes, that's
you
right.
had to pass it or not, right?
You
You had to
couldn't
pass
just
it.
become a lawyer by practicing with someone, you still had to take an exam for a period of time. Well, if you go back to the 1840s, all you had to do was practice for 2 years with, say, somebody's apprentice, and then you were a lawyer. But you had to be sworn in by a judge, which meant you paid. You bought your position, you know.
Yes.
That's the way it was. That's how judges got paid. And that's how they made a living. This guy, you know, Ripon judge, didn't get paid. I'm sorry, you had another question? Well, Todd, it was a
Well,
pleasure.
thank you very much, Steve. We certainly appreciate it. I can tell by the lively response you have here that it's quite interesting. Before we break for the evening, is there, anyone have any announcements? You know, sometimes you belong to another historical society. You make known to us that the peonies are in bloom or something going on in Rosendale. I don't want to dismiss have somebody come up to me later on and say, gee, I like to have told you this, but you forgot to. Yeah. Anyway, if there are no further questions, I think.
There's
Jordan
water
have
and
some-
lemonade in the back for anybody who wishes it.
If there's some refreshment back here, can have refreshments and capture Steve and tell him all the things you want to tell him. Thank you for coming. We'll hope to see you next month in October when we'll hear from George.
Thank you.